Live, online, and in person at the Tattle Library. Hey, everybody. My name's Aaron. I just wanted to introduce myself before we get this event started. I'm the president of Up North Pride. Just wanted to kind of touch base with all of you about some events that are coming up. Obviously, we've got Pride Month that's coming up in June here. We got a lot planned. We have a little bit of literature here in the back. Um, if you want to pick that up, we've got everything from, rec volleyball leagues on the grass, which is rad, little grass volleyball. We've got art nights that come up all the time. We do queer climbing nights over at Elevate across the street. We've got a lot of community partners who are hosting things that we're kind of putting out onto our event calendar for our friends on the internet. Hello, we're glad you're here. I hope I'm waving at the right thing. Please feel free to check us out at upnorthpride.com/events. We do have specifically like trans and non-binary support groups, as well as like social meetup hours as well. That I believe May 30th is the date that was sent to me, and then I was at work and it melted out of my brain. So it might not be right, but check the events calendar. We've got something happening just about every day in the month of June and this last half of May. And yeah, so thanks for making community happen. It's a lot of fun to be in the middle of it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Jay Kaplan from the ACLU, who's going to give us kind of a rundown on the legal side of what's happening in America. I don't think he needs any introduction. The man is great. Jay Kaplan, everybody.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you very much for having me back. I was here in January. I was actually here virtually in January. I ended up getting a really bad cold, so I just did the presentation from my house. But just for everybody who's listening on here and for your group, I work for the ACLU of Michigan, the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan. We are the protectors and defenders of constitutional rights and civil liberties, and we have a standalone LGBTQ plus legal project that we have been operating since 2001. We're only one of a handful of ACLU affiliates, state affiliates that have their own standalone project. And we cover the entire state of Michigan, and we focus on LGBTQ legal issues and policy issues that have an impact on the community. And I feel very fortunate to have been working with this project since it started 24 years ago this month. So the last time I was here, it was January 22nd, and President Trump had just been had his second inauguration, and we were anticipating a lot of things that we were concerned about. And now that we're 100 plus days away from that date, I can tell you that just about everything we anticipated and more happened. And I kind of wanted to start out giving you a rundown about some of these executive orders, what is being done to challenge them, what is the impact in the state of Michigan, what's happening in the state of Michigan regarding LGBTQ rights, and what are things that all of us can do in order to have a voice to take a stand about this. So I think when we were talking back in January, we were concerned that Project 2025, which was a campaign plan that then candidate Trump disavowed, said he knew nothing about it, had nothing to do with his campaign. They had a lot of things in there, particularly talking about attacks against the transgender community. And what we've seen since January 22nd is an unprecedented amount of executive orders targeting the transgender community. Now, when we think about this in total perspective, we're talking about a population that makes up between a half to possibly 1% of the entire U.S. population, and yet this administration has seen fit to issue 8 executive orders against the transgender community. And I wanted to go through some of them and talk about what some of the legal challenges. One of the first executive orders was saying that for purposes of federal civil rights laws, if we're talking about sex discrimination, that we're only going to look at sex that was assigned to people at birth. We're not even going to take into account gender identity. So in essence, what that executive order said was that transgender people are not protected under current federal civil rights laws. The second executive order said no federal funds can be used to promote what's called gender ideology. They don't define what that means, but I'm assuming they mean any program that gets federal funding that focuses on transgender related issues. How that's all going to play out in terms of programs losing funding, we have to see what happens still. I want everybody to keep in mind as we're talking about executive orders what they are and what they aren't. An executive order is a policy directive. It's not a law. The president is not king. The president is not dictator. The president can issue policy directives to be carried out by different federal departments. And what they're supposed to do under the Administrative Procedures Act, they're supposed to say, okay, this is how we're going to implement this order. And then the public has time to comment on that. The executive orders are also subject to review by the judicial branch. In other words, our courts can review the constitutionality of these orders. And many of these orders that I'm going to talk about tonight are clearly unconstitutional. And what they also do, they involve the executive branch exceeding their authority. In other words, it's Congress that appropriates funding, federal funding, and decides we're going to budget so much money for these programs. The president doesn't have the constitutional ability to say, I don't like this program, so I'm going to stop funding for it. It doesn't work that way. So it's important that we keep this in mind, because I think one of the most disturbing things I've seen is what they call as anticipatory obedience by certain entities, by individuals, by businesses, because they fear negative repercussions from this administration if they don't do so. And my message is, it's not done until the court says that this is, and all the way up to the highest court says that something is legal and constitutional. So back to the executive orders. Another executive order was to deny transgender people the ability to receive federal identity documents in accordance with their gender identity. So the way that works with a passport, for 30 years, people have been able to change the gender marker on their passports. There were usually different requirements over different administrations. But what this policy says is the only gender marker you're going to receive on a passport is male or female, what was assigned to you at birth. So what this means is people who are trying to amend their passport to reflect their gender identity are no longer able to do so. This means if you currently have a passport that's maybe it does reflect your gender identity, when that passport expires and you're trying to get a new passport, you're going to get a passport that reflects the gender that was assigned to you at birth. How they have that information, the ability to find that information, they're spending that time to do so. And what this means for members of our transgender, non-binary, intersex communities is that they're going to have a passport which doesn't align with what maybe their driver's license says, what their birth certificate says. And what that also means is they may have difficulties when traveling, particularly overseas, with different border agencies, if if the passport doesn't match their gender expression, their gender presentation, as well as other ID documents. Now, as I mentioned to you before, what has to happen is the administration should have, through the Administrative Procedures Act, set forth how are we going to implement this policy. They didn't do any of that. They just immediately implemented this policy. The ACLU filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging the constitutionality of it. On two grounds in particular. One, we have a thing in our Constitution, it's called the Equal Protection Clause, and it says anytime the government singles out a group of people for discriminatory treatment, it triggers the Equal Protection Clause. The other claim that they made is that the administration failed to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And they brought this case on behalf of 6 individuals who would not be able to have passport that accurately reflects who they are. And what we asked for from the court was what's called a preliminary injunction. Preliminary injunction is an order that says we're going to stop the implementation of this policy while we review the legal merits of the case. And so what the court did was they issued a preliminary injunction, but only on behalf of those 6 individuals. And so what the ACLU has requested is that the court expand that preliminary injunction to make it nationwide to cover all people who are negatively impacted by this executive order. And if the court does grant that, then we would see a nationwide injunction, and the administration would have to go back to the way things were done regarding passports, prior to Trump being inaugurated on January 20th. Now, what we are seeing happen, and this happens many times, is the Trump administration is appealing to, once a preliminary injunction is issued against an executive order, then they request that the next level, which is the Circuit Court of Appeals, they ask that that be lifted. And if that doesn't happen, then they've asked the United States Supreme Court. And that's what happened in the case of the transgender military ban. Some of you might remember in his first administration, President Trump via tweet issued an executive order prohibiting transgender people, openly transgender people, from being able to enlist in the military. And there was litigation over that policy, and we had a situation where a lower court issued a preliminary injunction against the policy, and the United States Supreme Court removed that while they were looking at the merits of the legal challenge. And by the end of Trump's first term, the policy was still in effect, and then President Biden rescinded that executive order, and transgender people were able to enlist in the military and to openly serve. This new executive order not only reinstates the ban on being able to enlist in the military, but also calls for any openly transgender people currently serving in the military to automatically be discharged. And regardless of the merits of their service, regardless how long they've served, what benefits they might be eligible for had they served longer, immediately, they're going to have to leave. And so several legal challenges were brought against the military policy, challenging the constitutionality of that. One of the things that we've seen in the language of these executive orders is not only are they discriminatory, but the language, the politicized language, the characterization of transgender people. So in other words, they said, being transgender in and of itself makes you unlikely to be able to serve and to be able to adhere to military discipline and to provide for military cohesiveness, despite the fact that thousands of people who identify as transgender currently do serve in the military and have served honorably. So legal action was filed against it, and we saw once again a preliminary injunction issued against the enforcement of this military ban. And so transgender people were able to enlist and to be able to currently serve. And then the Trump administration asked the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to lift that ban. I'm sorry, it was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to lift the ban. And the Ninth Circuit said, no, we're not going to do that. There's going to be harm to transgender individuals serving in the military. So then the Trump administration went to the United States Supreme Court, and in a 6-3 decision, you have 6 conservative justices, 3 progressive justices, they lifted the ban. So that means now, while this case is working up its way, this military ban is in place, and the Trump administration announced that by June 7th, they're going to discharge all currently serving transgender military professionals unless they leave on their own before that date. So, and this is the thing, we look to, well, we have checks and balances with our government, right? We have the legislative branch, we have the judicial branch, we have the executive branch. We would like to think that maybe the legislative branch would put some checks and balances on this administration, but clearly they're not willing to do so. Certainly not the Republican majority in both the House and the United States Senate. So we have to rely on the courts. But what we have to understand is We're not always going to get what we want from the courts. Ultimately, many of these decisions will rest with the United States Supreme Court. And keep in mind, presidential elections have consequences. President Trump was able to appoint 1/3 of the Supreme Court during his first term. And these are conservative justices who clearly don't have an understanding about what it means to be transgender, about the impact of these things, probably don't even care. And they will be ultimately making decisions on some of these cases. So we might have some wins, but ultimately they might be overturned by this type of court. Well, I'll mention this in a little bit later. Another executive order that the administration issued was an order saying any entity that's providing gender affirming health care to transgender people 19 years and younger, you will lose your federal funding if you're offering gender affirming care, even if you're not using federal dollars to provide gender affirming care. So any health clinic that might provide hormone therapy or counseling to transgender youth 19 years and younger, they could lose all their funding. And what we saw initially was that a number of programs, even in the state of Michigan, that was providing gender affirming health care to transgender youth, some of them started announcing they were closing down their program. And the other thing about executive orders is an executive order doesn't cancel other federal case law that has been issued. It doesn't cancel federal civil rights laws, and it doesn't cancel state civil rights laws. And our state civil rights laws explicitly cover LGBTQ people. We are one of 23 states that have these protections. And so discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression is prohibited in the state of Michigan. Prohibited discrimination in employment, in housing, in education, as well as this large umbrella term, which is called public accommodations, which would include health care. So after a lot of advocacy from LGBTQ groups around the state, as well as a letter from our Attorney General, Dana Nessel, to healthcare programs reminding them, if you stop providing these services and you say, I'm not providing services to transgender youth, you may be in violation of the state civil rights law. Some of these programs that said they were stopping, they reversed themselves. And the ACLU also filed a legal challenge in federal court, challenging the constitutionality of this executive order, talking about the harm that would be done to many transgender youth to have their medical care interrupted and to have entities lose all their federal funding. And so initially the court granted what's called a temporary restraining order. In other words, saying, okay, we're going to stop it for the next couple days, and then we're going to do further legal briefing on whether or not we should issue a preliminary injunction. And so this federal court did issue a nationwide preliminary injunction. In other words, saying you cannot initiate this policy. And in a state like Michigan, where we don't have a ban on providing gender affirming care for youth, transgender youth are still able to access that care. Of course, the Trump administration has appealed that decision and is asking the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to lift that temporary restraining order. There hasn't been any decision made on that issue yet. And if the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decides, we're not going to lift the injunction, then they'll try to go to the United States Supreme Court. But I should also mention, even though with this preliminary injunction, this has not stopped the Trump administration from sending letters to healthcare facilities threatening to take away their federal funding and sending letters to medical providers threatening to arrest them for providing gender affirming healthcare. I also want to include that we can expect in the next couple of weeks, maybe it could be in May, more likely in June, a decision from the United States Supreme Court on a case called Skrmetti. And what that involves is the constitutionality of states that have bans on gender affirming care for transgender youth. And the court will be deciding, can states do this sort of thing? And it's so interesting when you look at these different arguments. we have very strong protections for families to make private medical decisions concerning their health care, including their kids. And obviously, this is something that families, parents make in consultation with their doctor who has expertise in transgender health care, and they decide whether or not they're going to undergo hormone therapy. And this idea that elected officials, due to politics, can override a medical decision. Where's the only place we've seen that? With access to an abortion. And it's these so-called conservatives who want the government out of their business are only too happy to have that in the business of families that have transgender children. The other thing that's important to know about many of these bans is they do allow cisgender youth who might be having delayed puberty, they can access hormone therapy. So clearly that is discriminatory because you're singling out a group of people and you're saying you're not entitled to this health care. How do we think the Supreme Court might decide this decision? Well, I want to say it's difficult to say, but based on the arguments, it doesn't seem too difficult to say. It seems like there's probably going to be enough votes with the conservative majority to uphold the constitutionality that states can do this sort of thing. If that happens, it doesn't impact Michigan because we are kind of this island of unto ourselves where we do provide for gender affirming healthcare. But our next door neighbors, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee all have bans. In fact, 24 out of 50 states have these transgender healthcare bans. I'm gonna get more into this issue because I think it's important that we talk about the narrative that's being used to support this thing, and that we have a way to respond to this narrative of people who are behind this kind of legislation. There was also an executive order issued threatening to take away federal funding from public school districts that support the quote, social transition of transgender students. They don't really define what that means, but they do talk about school districts, if you let trans kids access restrooms in accordance with their gender identity, if you acknowledge their chosen name or pronouns, if you let a transgender female student play sports in accordance with their gender identity, we will take away your federal funding. And in this particular instance, we are seeing the Trump administration at least following some kind of Administrative Procedures Act. In other words, they are investigating school districts. I haven't heard of them investigating Michigan school districts, but different school districts that are being supportive of transgender students. For instance, in Virginia, by allowing trans students to access restrooms. And in Maine, they have sued Maine public schools because female transgender students are permitted to play school sports in accordance with their gender identity. We're fortunate in Michigan that a majority of school districts are represented by one particular law firm, and they are giving out good, accurate legal advice to these school districts. And they're saying, okay, school districts, if you're concerned, if you have a policy in writing that says, trans kids can use restrooms, trans kids can play school sports, we're going to respect the names and pronouns. If you decide that you don't want that in writing anymore because you're afraid of the Trump administration, being in the crosshairs there, you can rescind that policy, but you must comply with state civil rights laws. And to have a practice where you say to trans kids, you can't use the bathrooms, we won't respect who you are, we won't acknowledge who you are, you can't play school sports, all of those things would be in violation of our state civil rights laws. And we have been, the ACLU of Michigan, we've been watching very, very carefully school districts trying to change some of those policies, and we have threatened to sue them. We have filed civil rights complaints against certain school districts that have done that. And so far, we've seen school districts reverse their stance. In other words, if they told a student, you can no longer use a bathroom, once we sent a letter or if we filed a complaint, they reverse themselves on this. But this isn't going to go away anytime soon. And I think until we see a large federal legal action against this policy as a whole, where maybe a court will also issue an injunction, we're going to still see school districts being threatened by this administration. And essentially, what this administration is trying to do in our state of Michigan is say, you have to discriminate against trans kids. And if you don't do, we're going to do that. We're going to take away all your federal dollars. And we got to ask ourselves, this is government? This is democracy? This is the way our country, these are the principles our country was founded on. I still scratch my head about that. It wasn't enough. The school executive order. Trump also issued an executive order saying that any high schools or colleges that receive federal funding that allow transgender females to play in interscholastic sports, that they will lose their federal funding if they do so. And we've seen some legal actions filed against that. And we're just going to have to see how some of these things play out. I want to just do a little sidebar about why is this all happening? Once again, we're talking about a very small population. Why is there so much focus on the transgender community? There was an article in the New York Times in 2023, and it was looking at organizations that have opposed LGBTQ rights over the past several decades. And they talked about they had a meeting when they lost on the issue of marriage equality. Once the Obergefell decision was issued by the United States Supreme Court saying that same-sex couples had a constitutional right to marry and to the benefits of marriage, they recognized that they lost a big fight. So they got together and they said, you know what? How are we going to keep raising money? How are we going to keep, our political power going once we've lost on this issue? Can we find another group within the LGBTQ community that maybe people don't know a lot about, that we can marginalize, that we can create a narrative to help us raise money, to help us gain political power? And they decided, let's go after the transgender community. Particularly, let's go after transgender youth, because a lot of people in the general public don't know what it means to be transgender. They think they don't know anybody who's transgender, and so we'll create this narrative. And there was a study showing that Fox News Network in 2023, I'm sorry, presented more than 450 negative stories about transgender people. And they created these different narratives. And I'll give you an example. This idea that there's all these transgender girls playing sports and they're taking away slots from cisgender girls, and they're pretending to be transgender so they can win competitions. And when we look at the actual information, so for instance, it's in Michigan public schools, we have 850 public school districts, and in the past 20 years, there have been a total of 10 transgender girls who played interscholastic sports. Currently, there are 0 transgender girls playing. Now, it shouldn't matter that it's a small number, because that shouldn't matter, but you see all this attention that's focused on this. The other thing is, in Michigan, our Michigan High School Athletic Association has a process. I'm not crazy about it, but it kind of answers these questions. If a transgender girl wants to play in interscholastic sports, they do an individualized assessment of her. They determine, you're on puberty blockers, have you had hormone therapy, to determine whether or not there's an unfair competitive advantage. Using this process, they've never turned away a transgender female student from being able to play in school sports, but there is a process in place to address this presumption of an unfair competitive advantage. The other thing is, there recently was a study done about sports. And in terms of a transgender female, it really does depend on the individual, and it depends on the sport. If someone was receiving puberty blockers, as they were engaging, chances are they didn't, in terms of levels of testosterone and growth and things like that, that didn't even happen to them. But also, studies have shown that a transgender female does not necessarily have competitive advantage in certain sports. So we need to have this conversation, but unfortunately, there is this assumption automatically that this is the truth, this is the narrative, and that somehow the presence of transgender females playing sports, girls sports, is taking away opportunities for cisgender girls, which is not borne out in the actual facts and the actual information. The other thing is, if we decide that, someone won that race because their legs are taller, or they're faster, or they have stronger arms, or, whatever, when we start looking also at cisgender athletic competition, aren't we going to start hearing people say, "Oh, that wasn't fair. She's 2 inches taller than me, two cisgender girls running." And I mean, they could make those same arguments. And what I find so interesting is that these same politicians that say, "We need to protect girls' sports. We need to make sure that there's, opportunity for girls in sports," they're the same people that vote against increasing funding to make sure that girls' sports, the opportunities available to all girls, are comparable to the boys' sports that where funding is appropriated for all those opportunities. It's kind of ironic. So that's me on my soapbox, but I think it is all about that narrative. And we're also seeing the same attack against the transgender community with our Michigan legislature. Some of you might know that for for the first time in 40 years, we had a progressive majority in Michigan's state legislature in both the House as well as our state Senate. It was the first time since 1983. And so during that 2-year period, we saw the legislature pass comprehensive civil rights protections for LGBTQ people. We saw them pass a law banning conversion therapy. We saw them passing a law providing greater recognition of same-sex parents. So they would have the same, so for married couples and unmarried couples, they're the same recognition for same-sex parents of children. And they wouldn't have to go through the fiction of a step-parent adoption if they're raising children together. Some great accomplishments, but as a result of the 2024 election, we now find the Michigan Republicans are in control of the state house. And in the last 3 months, they've introduced more than 6 pieces of anti-transgender legislation. Legislation involving sports, and just yesterday they introduced legislation that would ban gender affirming healthcare for transgender youth, that would involve medical licenses being taken away from professionals that provide gender affirming care, and would provide money to be available. It would require Michigan's Medicaid program to cover conversion therapy for transgender kids, as well as gay and lesbian kids. Some of you might know that conversion therapy is a discredited practice where they purport they're going to change your sexual orientation back to what your parents thought it was when you were first born, or they're going to change back your gender identity. So this is the kind of stuff that they've been introducing. And if I may take a minute, let's just talk about this narrative here too. So there have been many, many studies done about gender affirming healthcare, both for transgender adults as well as for youth. And they have found by medical organizations and evidence-based studies that this can be a very effective treatment for people who've been diagnosed with a condition called gender dysphoria, which means you identify differently from the gender that was assigned to you at birth. 25 years of studies that have proven this to be effective treatment. The treatment for transgender youth is not surgery. Most surgeries are not available till you're a legal adult, but it usually is, can be recommended to undergo hormone therapy. And studies show an improvement in the quality of life and mental health outcomes for transgender youth where this is appropriate, who are able to access this treatment. They can only access this treatment if they're found eligible for it by a doctor who specializes in transgender healthcare, and their parents or legal guardians agree to this treatment. No kid can say, "I'm trans, I want to be on hormones. Here's your hormones today." It doesn't work that way, despite the narrative that we see. And we also see this narrative out there that somehow that transgender kids are getting surgery. That's simply false. So last week, the Trump administration came out the Department of Health and Human Services came out with a purported study regarding gender affirming care for trans youth. And it contained so much junk science and mis and disinformation about trans healthcare that nobody signed it. No one's identified in that study who wrote it. But they call for conversion therapy. They do support that. So that's out there now. And you might have heard that there's some opponents of transgender healthcare. One person named Jamie Reed, who is on the national circuit. She's in Michigan this week, speaking out against and meeting with legislators, because next week there's going to be a hearing on those bills, which hopefully won't pass the House, hopefully would never make it through the Senate. And even if they did, hopefully our governor would not sign that into law. But, and I find the other thing is, I find it interesting that with all the issues and challenges that we as Michiganders have in our own lives or other people share, that our elected officials, certain elected officials, have decided this is the top priority. This is the top problem, that supposed problem that needs to be solved. And I would love to ask, the representative and the state senator who introduced these bills yesterday, what are you doing? What's your plan to increase more affordable housing? What are you doing to lower the cost of prescription drugs in the state of Michigan? What are you doing to increase access to health care? What are you doing to provide more opportunities for individuals either graduating high school or going to trade school, that they will have the opportunity to be trained in certain skills so they can have a job with a livable wage? What are the answers to that? And I maintain that all of this is a distraction. It's a distraction to their inability to come up with constructive policy ideas that address the things that people really do care about. And sure, let's point the finger at one of the most marginalized populations in our country, and let's just try to erase existence of them. Let's deny them the dignity and humanity that we provide for everybody else. And I think it's politics at its most cynical and at its most heartless. And if you read the language of some of these executive orders, they call it chemical mutilation hormone therapy for transgender people. And the hyperbolic language that is so lacking in compassion and understanding of a very small group of people. And it shouldn't matter that it's a very small group of people, but why is it that there's this relentless push to keep attacking, and attacking? And I think, and I'm going to talk to you about things that we can do, I think all of us as voters, as if we don't identify as trans, cisgender, as allies, we owe it to the transgender community to ask our elected officials, why are you focusing on this? Why are you spending so much time on this? Why are you continuing to bullying a group of people when there's so many other issues you should be addressing? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask anybody who's behind what I consider to be really crappy legislation. So I'm going to take a sip of water, because I'm here to talk about LGBTQ issues, and certainly I'm spending a lot of time on transgender issues because that has been where the focus of the attacks are on. But make no mistake, the transgender attacks are simply a trajectory. And then let's get the people not a lot of people know about, understand, and then we'll move on. And we'll do things to the gay and lesbian community, like take away all funding for health research studies into health disparities in the LGBTQ community. Money gone, programs ended. That happened. Erase any mention of all LGBTQ people on the White House website. I mean, that's symbolic. That's not that important, but that happened the very first day. To have the National Endowment of the Arts saying you can't give out any grants that might be associated with either with gender ideology or promoting alternative lifestyles like LGBTQ lifestyles. It's all there. Some of you might have heard, this is back in February, once again, our legislative majority in the House, in their prioritization wisdom, they introduced a bill that calls for a resolution asking the United States Supreme Court to overturn the marriage equality decision, to overturn the Obergefell decision. And, the response to that was great. It was swift. You heard so many legislators, openly LGBTQ legislators, as well as allies, speak out against this, saying, nope, this is not happening. We saw our Attorney General post a picture of her showing her wedding ring, but she had her finger in a different position about the idea about getting rid of marriage equality. You had our governor say, hell no, this is not going to happen. And that's great. That's great. And I have to tell you, yeah, I mean, should we be concerned about marriage equality with this United States Supreme Court? I think we should. I think what demonstrated with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision 3 years ago is that this is a court majority that's willing to overturn legal precedent that's been established, and in the abortion case, almost 50 years. Usually when a court overturns a decision that they issued before, they point to either change in public attitudes, or they point to a change in terms of how federal courts have addressed this issue. They couldn't point to anything in the Dobbs decision. And yet, there was a majority of those justices that wanted to reach that result. And they did. They found a way to say, yes, states can ban, the right and access to abortion. And that should be concerning, because that's not the way our court's supposed to operate. And once again, it's, anybody who tells you when you go to vote in an election that doesn't make any difference between the two candidates, you just have to look at what's happened with our United States Supreme Court. And we also should be concerned with regards to the issue of marriage equality, because Justice Thomas, in his concurrence in overturning the Roe v. Wade decision, said, hey, you know what? The next case we need to look at is marriage equality. We need to take a look at that. And Justice Alito has come out publicly and said, I think, the marriage equality decision was wrongfully decided. The court should take that up sometime. So how does a case get up to the United States Supreme Court? Well, there has to be a case in a lower court, and there has to be something to directly challenge. And usually that takes a long time. And right now, there is no legislation in any state legislature that would deny same-sex couples the right to get married. No one is trying to pass that kind of legislation. They might try somewhere down the line. There is no current case in the pipeline, in a federal court pipeline, challenging the marriage equality decision. So what I'm saying about that is the threat of that is definitely several years away from now. And that's important because we want to keep an eye on it, and we certainly want to react and respond to that. But I think sometimes our own LGBTQ community, as well as some of our allies, they've lost sight of what's the most immediate danger, the most immediate harm, and what should be the most immediate priority. And that is fighting back against the attacks against the transgender community. So like I said, it was a great response from Michigan legislators, great response from our Attorney General, our governor. But I have to say, there has been a very tepid, relatively silent response when it comes to transgender issues. And I posted something on Facebook today about this new legislation that was introduced about healthcare. And somebody from the gay community, he wrote a comment, and he said, well, I'm gay. Should I even care about transgender people? I mean, what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with my community? Are they actually harming our cause? And my first response, I was very angry. But my second response was, no, you know what? We have to have these conversations. This has to come up because I do feel that it is a sentiment with some members of our own community, as well as some of our strongest allies. And this is what I would say to them, is that we are not an LGBTQ community without the T. And when you look at what motivates the discrimination against our community as a whole, it's gender stereotypes. In other words, I don't like gay people because I think if you were born male, you should be attracted to females. And because you're not, I'm going to discriminate against you. I don't like transgender people because I think if you were assigned male at birth, you should be presenting as male. You shouldn't be identifying as female. It's all about gender stereotyping, which our federal courts have held that's a form of sex discrimination. And when you look at the LGBTQ civil rights movement, if you say, yeah, let's get rid of the T and we'll be okay, let's start from Stonewall, 1969. The uprising in the bar because people were tired of law enforcement harassing them in the bar and arresting them for holding hands. Who are the people who led that revolt? Transgender women of color. They were the ones on the front line. I know there was some movie that came out about Stonewall. It was all white, muscly men who looked like they'd be the cover of magazines, but they weren't the people who were the leaders of that rebellion. When you look at the cases that have moved LGBTQ rights forward, I mentioned to you about gender stereotyping. Most of them were transgender cases that then federal court said, yeah, using that rationale with a transgender discrimination case, I guess gay people are covered too. So the transgender part of our community has been a significant part of our community and moving LGBTQ rights forward. And this idea that, okay, I'm just going to focus on mine and not focus on everybody else is really a flawed assumption in that. The ACLU of Michigan, we represented Amy Stevens, a transgender woman who was fired from her job at a funeral home when she came out as trans. And she decided she wasn't going to take that. She wanted to challenge it. And her case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. And it was combined with 2 cases involving gay employees who were fired from their jobs because their employer thought they were gay or discovered they were gay. And the issue before the United States Supreme Court was, since we don't have federal civil rights laws that explicitly protect LGBTQ people, is it sex discrimination? Is it in violation of a federal civil rights law that prohibits sex discrimination when you fire someone because they're LGBTQ? And the court said yes in 2020. And for the first time, members of our community, LGBTQ people who were discriminated against in their employment, they had a remedy to go in federal court. And that was because, in part, of Amy Stevens' case. Amy, who I got to know very well because we worked together for 6 years, she passed away 6 weeks before the decision came out. She was in kidney failure while the case was being heard before the United States Supreme Court. She did attend the hearing, and she wanted so badly to live long enough to see this result. But her legacy does live on. And so my message to our LGBTQ community as a whole, we have to stand up. Well, if we can't stand up, that's a wrong term to use. We have to speak up and speak out and take a position in support of our transgender community. We can't say this doesn't concern me, this isn't a part of my life, because as I mentioned before, this is part of a trajectory. There are opponents, and if you read that Project 2025, what they want to do is they want to deny the existence and the recognition of LGBTQ people. If it's not there, it's not there. And we see that. We are in a library tonight, and what we're seeing in Michigan are all these attempts to try to remove books that feature LGBTQ characters and situations from the library because certain people don't like the fact that these people are being featured. And they want to make the decision for everybody else what people can see. And it's not only removing the books, it's sometimes moving them just, behind the librarian's desk. So a young LGBT youth who might benefit from seeing a story about somebody who's like themselves can't access that book because their parents might know what book they're taking out. And that's clearly a violation of the First Amendment. So make no mistake, all the stuff I told you about, against the transgender community, it's part of an overall trajectory targeted against the community as a whole, targeting the community as a whole. So I wanted to offer, it's enough. It's It's not enough. It's not enough to say all the things. Things are pretty bad right now. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it for any of you. And I'll be honest with you, many times I wake up or I go to bed at night and I say, what is this world? What is going on here? You know, how did we get this way? How do we allow ourselves to get this way? And I don't have any answers about that, but I do know there are things that we can do, and we are seeing things that people can do too. First of all, easiest thing you can do a statement. Do a statement in support of the trans community. If you're on Facebook, put an article saying that you support a public statement. Many members of the transgender community are currently feeling undefended. They're feeling vulnerable, and they're afraid, and they need to hear other voices around them. Just a simple statement like that. Number two, contact your legislator, your elected officials. Let's just remind you, even if you didn't vote for that person, your taxes are paying for their salary. And if you don't agree with what they're doing, you have every right to question them. And you have every right to question why they are focusing, why they continue to attack part of our community and their rationale. And if you're a member of the LGBT community, it's so important that they see your faces. I'll never forget, I've been at the ACLU a long time, 24 years. This was maybe like 10, 15 years ago, where some legislator stood up and said, I don't have any gay people in my district. Yeah, right. Um, doesn't work that way. So when they see someone's face, when they see a constituent who's impacted by this, even a family member, that can really make a difference. Number three, attend a rally or a gathering or organization. We're seeing these wonderful, sometimes spontaneous organizations of people coming out. Doesn't necessarily have to be 10,000 people in one place, but just the fact that 50 people or 100 people show up. And it's not, okay, it has to be on a certain date twice a year. This can be throughout. It's making a difference. It's the visibility of seeing people say, you know what? This is not what I want. This is not what I wanted, and this is not what I want. This is not acceptable to me. Your voice counts for so much. And when we come collectively together, we increase our power. And, and it's my hope too, and I'm sure that it will be built in. We have Pride Month coming up next month as well as all summer. And I think it's very important that we do celebrate who we are. And it's very important that we celebrate the gains that we made. But I also hope that Pride will incorporate the sober realization that our community is under attack right now. And that a lot of the progress that we've made, there are some very strong attempts to try to roll that back. And we need, while we're celebrating who we are, we need to acknowledge that, and we need to make a commitment through our pride, through the good feelings we have about who we are. We need to commit ourselves also to be part of this fight. It's very, very important. I think all those wonderful celebrations will be missing a significant thing if that's not incorporated into those events. And then lastly, I think, I hear, and I feel that way too. A lot of people say, God, I feel so overwhelmed. It doesn't stop every single day. He's going to reopen Alcatraz. He's going to 100% tariff on movies. He's going to do this. He wants to be the Pope. And, I can't, where do I start? What do I say? And you have to know the purpose of what they're trying to do. They're doing this on purpose. They want you to feel overwhelmed. They want you to feel helpless, and they want you to feel like it's all hopeless. So knowing that's your strategy, figure out what can I focus on? What can I focus on? What can I follow? And what can I do about that? I might not be able to stand out, to just take a stand on every single issue that's going on in the country. But what's something that I can do? The other important thing is to take care of ourselves, because the opponents would like you to feel defeated and exhausted and have you live in fear and negatively impact your mental health, so that you want to give up. So you got to take care of yourself. We can only be strong enough for this fight, for this response, if we're taking care of our own well-being. And the last thing is find your joy. It's okay to do things that give you enjoyment, that give you happiness, that might be outside of politics. You have to have that. You know, folks who doom scroll on their social media and read one bad thing after, and I'm equally guilty. How do you feel after that? You just you want to go back to bed. You don't want to. So find the things that make you happy and that make help you recognize that it's good to be alive and all the things that you can be grateful for, because that's also going to make us stronger. So I've been talking for about an hour, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions and comments. Take a sip of water. And does anybody have any questions, comments? And I don't know if I'm supposed to bring the micro. I think I'm supposed to bring the microphone to you because they're filming this for the video. Oh, it reminds me.
In the audience, just you.
Oh, God. Okay, so I had it all wrong. So you didn't have to use the mic if you don't have to.
Just in general, kind of going off of what you just said, which I very much agree with. I also think it's very important that everybody who is both LGBTQ and part of the progressive caucus should be focused on just showing confidence and joy to other people, because not only does that just innately bring more people to you, they want to be included with whatever you're doing, whatever fun you're having, it also kind of paints the hateful people who try to bring LGBTQ people down as the people who you don't want to be around. The people who only focus on hate, the people who only want to make the world a worse place, while you, even with all of the terrible things that are happening to you, are still full of joy because of this, you are confident with who you are and what you want to do moving forward.
Yeah.
So that's what I think is very important.
I agree. Excellent point. Thank you. Spot on. Spot on. Yeah. I mean, and you have to wonder, these people behind this stuff, how happy are they? I mean, how much happiness could you derive from this level of cruelty and callousness and this constant focus on trying to make somebody else's life harder, more difficult, more complicated? Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
850 school districts, and over some period of time, there's only been 10 trans females even wanting to play sports.
Trans females who actually did interscholastic school competition sports. Yeah.
Over like.
So half a trans kid every year for the last 20 years. Yeah. Yeah. This is this big problem that, we need like 5 pieces of state legislation being introduced in Michigan's legislature in the past 3 months, right? Right. And and someone brought up a good point. Somebody that I know in the trans community said, Jay, you know what? Don't keep emphasizing that small number too much, because the argument should be that trans kids, like every other kid, benefit by playing school sports, right? It's part of being on a team. It's part of an extracurricular activity. It makes you feel more invested in your school. Many times kids do academically better when they're involved in extracurricular activities. A trans female student can't meaningfully participate in sports if they're being told you have to be on the male team, but because they're told you can't be who you are, right? So, I mean, that's a very important argument to be made. But yes, the small numbers, and I didn't even mention, so the executive order about the collegiate sports, out of 550,000 college students playing sports, less than 10 are transgender females. So, I mean, someone can do the math. It was like 0.005 or something like that. But we have this executive order that's going to take away all the federal funding from colleges if they do that. Sure.
The Supreme Court upholding Trump's wanting to ban transgender from the military. So was there a caveat to that where it's just while other things are working?
So they didn't uphold the military ban. What they did is they lifted the preliminary injunction. So what that meant is now the policy can go into effect while the court slowly, so it's been appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has to review the case and decide, is this unconstitutional? And then but the policy still is going in effect. So in other words, the harm is happening. And uh, yeah, it's just it puts people's lives in flux. I know somebody who is serving in the military, and even with the ban in effect or not in effect, I could be without a job by tomorrow. Where do I go? Where do I live? What am I? Should I stay? Should I leave? It really creates a lot of uncertainty in people's lives, and this is a court majority that I find to be very callous many times with these preliminary injunctions when it comes to people who are currently suffering as a result of these policies. That's just my perception. Yeah.
Um, Little clarification on some of the military stuff. I'm a veteran. I'm a member of Sparta. We have pulled our lawsuit because of what was going on with shilling. We didn't want to screw up shilling at all.
Chilling is the Lambda lawsuit, right? Yes.
Benefits. If you end up going out on an administrative charge, you lose all of your benefits. Okay, so if you're someone that is currently in the military and you have, say, 15 years in and no record of any infraction whatsoever, meritorious remarks, in all of your service records, the choice is I get nothing or I get at least to keep my benefits. And a lot of them are just saying, screw it, I'm just going to keep my benefits, and they're leaving.
Sure.
And some of these, I know one of them is a chief warrant officer in the Navy who probably has a PhD in electronics, and is probably got a couple of $1 million worth of training investment in him that the U.S. government is going to lose for no good reason.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And one of the arguments that the administration makes for this military ban is the cost of gender affirming care, which is like $5 million. They spend $200 million on Viagra treatments, and the idea, trying to get people out, just in terms of that argument it's just so disingenuous, and it's really motivated by animus, which should never be upheld, right?
Isn't the whole term animus one that itself allows a court to go in and say, you've got to put a ban, you have to stop this because we've all identified animus as being directly discriminatory
Right.
against an individual.
Right. So the Supreme Court decided in a case, it was a gay rights case called Romer versus Evans. It was in 1996. And Colorado voters passed a law saying you could never pass any civil rights protections for gay and lesbian people. And it's clearly the campaign showed, animus towards this group. And the Supreme Court, the then Supreme Court said, you know what? The lowest level of scrutiny, the most deference we give to state governments, if you're doing just because you don't like a group of people, we're not going to uphold that. And part of the argument in a lot of these cases, challenges to these executive orders, is that this is being motivated by animus. I mean, it's very clearly what the Supreme Court should recognize in this Scrimeti case is this was motivated by animus. I mean, it's very clear these folks were doing this because it helps them, get elected. It helps them raise money. The language that they use and the disinformation. So in an ideal world, the court would strike down all these things because this is what is motivating animus towards transgender people. Yes.
I had a question about the executive order, or I don't know if it's an executive order, but where they're saying they'll take away an organization's nonprofit status if they do DEI type of things.
Yeah.
And just like, I haven't heard if there's any lawsuits against that or how we'll proceed. I'm on a board that offers a diversity scholarship.
Mhm.
And so we were advised to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Because we didn't want to lose our nonprofit status.
Mhm.
And Any thoughts on that?
So, once again, this is an example, and I get it. They're concerned, and I would call that anticipatory obedience because it's not that what the administration should have to do in a situation like that. They'd have to send a letter saying, you know what, you have this program and it violates our order, and we're going to do an investigation, and you have a right to respond. And then if we decide to take away your money, then we take an action, and you have the right to appeal it. All those things should be happening. What we're seeing is, Trump has threatened to investigate different nonprofits, including, we keep hearing rumors they're going to try to do it to the ACLU to try to take away our nonprofit status. But I haven't seen any of this stuff. It hasn't come out in an executive order so far. What I've seen, what I hear sometimes, even from businesses saying, we're getting rid of our DEI program, we're taking away all that language. But we still are supporting diversity, equity, inclusion. We're just getting rid of that name so it doesn't get in the crowd. I hope that's what's happening. But I think many times entities, nonprofits, as well as, commercial businesses, they have to take into account the optics of these things. What kind of message you're sending? So if a school district takes down their transgender policy, or says, we can't have the rainbow flag displayed at school, we won't allow any other flag except the American flag or the state flag, what kind of message are you sending to people? And what are you doing to reassure them that you are inclusive, that you are supportive, that other people are welcome? And that's my question to a lot of these folks. What are you doing? And when did diversity, equity, inclusion, this idea that we wanted people to feel, when did that become a bad thing? And the underlying principle behind this is that somehow these people who oppose us, that by including other people, something is being taken away from them, right? And that these people are less than me, and they couldn't possibly be hired or be part of a program qualified the way I'm qualified for it because of who they are. And it's just such a flawed ideology. And, I say a lot about narrative. I think, unfortunately, these groups have been able to create this narrative that's been certainly augmented and supplemented by so many different media outlets, including, certain television networks, that this just becomes accepted as, woke is a bad word, DEI is a bad thing, and somehow it's harmful. But just to circle back, they did a survey of voters about this election, because there also is this myth that if you support transgender people, it's going to hurt you politically. You're going to lose elections. That was not reflected in the after polling. That was the absolute last issue on the list of 100 other things. And DEI was also not a salient or important issue for most voters. DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion. It's a term. It's a terminology. Yeah.
Just one thing that I'd also like to add to what you were saying too. I think it was just today, actually, that the Trump administration has now agreed to halt all efforts to freeze funding for Maine's child nutrition program, because they were trying to do DEI, and they said they fought back against the Trump administration and recently just won.
Right.
So it's very important to, at least in my opinion, not only just not try to preemptively give up on these issues, but also try to band together to create larger groups that can fight back against the administration, who's trying to they can't fight everybody.
Right.
So they're trying to silence everybody by targeting very specific groups.
Right.
So
And other lawyers are leaving, the ones who were in the Department of Justice. A lot of people left or they got fired. And no, that's very true. So Maine, what they did was, due to trans athletes, they froze all the funding for nutrition programs in the schools, and Maine sued over that. And then there was this settlement. Trump administration is still going after Maine, trying to take away all the federal funding from the schools because of this issue. But I do believe a federal court looking at this issue will decide against them.
but I think something that applies to what a lot of people are participating in these days are protests.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the rights of citizens when they're protesting?
Right. So everyone has a First Amendment right to be able to participate in a protest. And even if your message or your position that you are taking doesn't, the government's not in agreement with that, you cannot be penalized for that. Now, that's the opposite of what we've been seeing. We've seen the Trump administration in terms of immigrants picking them up because somebody wrote an op-ed piece and sending them to a detention center or sending them to prisons. We've seen attempts, even at the University of Michigan has come up with this very draconian policy. Some of the protesters against the Israeli Gaza war have been suspended from school and not being permitted to be on campus. Not only U of M's the main campus, but also any auxiliary campus. And we filed a lawsuit challenging that policy. So this idea, one of the founding principles of our country is that I might not agree with your speech, but I will defend your right to have that speech. And the way we discuss, we present our point of view, but we don't penalize people for exercising those rights. So governments can have certain zoning ordinances about where, in the time and place and manner of where you can protest, but they can't unilaterally or just decide to arrest people because of the nature of the protest. Now, if somebody's engaging in violent behavior, which could happen at a protest, could happen any place, obviously that's something different. And we've seen, efforts. And so, in other words, what we're also seeing this administration is they're putting pressure on college campuses to crack down on a particular political viewpoint. If it seems to me the focus is if you take a position against Israel, at least with this administration, you're going to be penalized for that. And that's just wrong. Wherever you stand, you can be the strongest supporter of Israel, but you also defend the right of people to have a different position. Other questions or comments? This is a great discussion. I'm really enjoying hearing what everybody else has to say. Aaron.
Protest and kind of where the line is drawn, but obviously time, place, and manner exists. Under whose judgment is it disorderly now? Because I know that's kind of sort of the line. I work in the world of law enforcement and that's, when somebody is being disorderly and disruptive, who decides what that is?
Right.
Where is that line? What does that look like?
Well, it's interesting, right.
Disorderly.
Right. Well, there's usually, we look at other case law or what they've looked at, how do you define what disorderly conduct, but we can't just have, and so for instance, there's an LGBTQ community center on the other side of the state, and they were denied a permit to hold their event in this main park because they were told, last year there was disorderly conduct from opponents that were there. And so they came to talk to us about this. They said, well, there were some people shouting some things, but they didn't prevent the activity from going on. They didn't threaten violence against anybody. And do we want governmental entities to assume because a particular group there's going to be disorderly conduct to deny, by others to be able to deny that permit? So I think, I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think courts have looked at examples what are considered to be disorderly conduct. And I would maintain that people counter-protesting something or shouting things back, that wouldn't meet that threshold to be able to, either charge somebody or deny a group from being able to assemble.
Just
Yeah.
one point.
Sure.
I'm also a member of Michigan, Traverse City Indivisible and Equality
Wonderful.
Michigan.
Yes.
And we have guidelines for safe protesting. And so if you go to any of our websites, you'll find guidelines, for safe protesting techniques and so forth. And we've had 4 pop-up protests here in the last 2 months, and we've had an amazing number of people show up. Your neighbors who you didn't even know show up at the protest, and it's kind of a kick. So, I mean, it's like, for me, 1970 all over again.
That's wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned about Equality Michigan because we work very closely with them. Equality Michigan is the LGBTQ lobbying organization for the state. And next Wednesday, May the 14th is going to be Lobby Day. And it's the day before there's going to be hearings on the anti-trans healthcare bills. And if anybody has the time and the ability to make a little long road trip to be part of that, that would be great. That would be great. The other thing I want to mention too is the ACLU's website also has information about your rights to protest. And there's also an organization called the National Lawyers Guild. And many times what they'll do, if they have people available in a particular area, they will be observers to make sure that people are being treated fairly, that law enforcement is following the letter of the law with regards to those events. Somebody else say, yeah.
So this is sort of, well, I'm just gonna say it. So I've been in those at those protests and they're wonderful and they build community and you get to know who your community is, that if you're unsure, but and all along, lots of people say, well, if you protest, you know, safely, then nothing's gonna happen to you. But we're seeing everywhere that doesn't apply anymore. I mean, you know what I'm saying? In general, that would never happen is what people say. That would never happen, and yet it's happened.
Well, I think, yeah.
And so, my personal question is, I'm also a guardian of my brother. And I just was doing my yearly report and on there it says, have you ever been arrested? And all of a sudden I went, oh my God, what happens if I got arrested? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
You know, and what, you know, and I am being careful, but that doesn't mean that something will happen.
Sure. Well, thank you for bringing this up. And I think you're bringing up a concern we're seeing with this administration. We're seeing people, particularly immigrants, either legally or not legally, being picked up, being taken away without anybody being told where they're going, being sent out of this country. We heard our president make a statement. He'd like to take homegrowns, U.S. citizens. We heard the question about, I think it was from the Department of Justice, could U.S. citizens be deported too? So obviously that gives us pause and concern. The bottom line though is, and I'm hoping that our United States Supreme Court is going to hold firm and make it very explicit that everyone's entitled to due process. Certainly on, with Abrego Garcia in terms of they're going to have a hearing later this month and get more specific, but make it explicitly clear that you can't do this sort of thing. But it is scary. And I know people are concerned about traveling. Could they be stopped at the airport? And, if they have a certain lawn sign on their front lawn, what if, so who knows? I mean, we see these ICE agents, they're not wearing necessarily uniforms and stuff, but we here in Detroit, people being stopped, at stores and things like that, U.S. citizens, and being asked to show their identity documents and being questioned. It is a real concern. But you also bring up another really good point. That's why it is so important that we have this groundswell of community when people coming out. And, you mentioned about, I spoke at a rally in Dexter. I don't know if people are familiar. It's pretty much a white community, very conservative community, but 400 people showed up. And I can imagine that some of them might identify as politically conservative on some issues, but there's a lot of people that are concerned about some of these things that are happening. And, and it's a challenge because we want to keep this momentum going, and we really don't have a chance to effectively make our stand until November of 2026. That's a long way to go. I don't know about you, but I feel like the last 3 months has felt like 5 years. It's exhausting, right? So, yeah.
So there's a question online saying, other than the wonderful advice given so far, is there anything specific that those people who will be attending the LGBTQ Advocacy Day in Lansing should know?
Well, I think they have a whole program planned out. Emmy Zanotti, who's the political director, they're going to be talking about the issues. They're going to assign people to visit certain legislators. They'll provide them with talking points. They won't have people having to go all by themselves. They'll go in pairs, and they're going to have some really effective and significant action steps that people can take there. So, and if people can't make that, people have to work, so, other obligations, transportation issues, still can make phone calls or send emails to their elected officials as well. Yeah.
So as someone who'll be representing this area, I'll be at the advocacy day, so people can send things directly to Up North Pride's info at if there's like specific points. I'm happy to be the conduit to take that information along.
That's great. And I wanted to mention too, I hope people don't feel, I don't get up to Traverse City that often. I hope they don't feel this is our last conversation. You can always contact me directly at my email address. Maybe you can make that available. Always feel free to reach out. Even if you don't have a specific legal issue of your own, it's just a question about what's happening, because we not only want to be an advocate and attorney, but also want to be a resource to the community. And I remember coming here 30 years ago, and there was no LGBTQ center. And I remember that people, when they had certain events, people would come from 100 miles away just to participate at gatherings, to find a place where they belong. So I'm so thrilled that you do have your center and you have all these wonderful events that are coming up. And that's the other thing I neglected. Another thing all of us can do is support our LGBTQ organizations, support our community center, which does so much good for the community. And all these organizations, none of them are rolling in dough or anything like that. They sometimes it's just spit and polish or whatever just to keep it together. But it's very important that we keep these things, because that signifies our existence, that we do exist. And that we're not going away anyplace either. So, yeah.
One more online question. Have there been any updates on the ACLU court case regarding the group of transgender individuals who are trying to get proper gender markers on their passports?
Yes. So the update on that is the ACLU filed a motion asking the judge, because the judge issued a preliminary injunction on behalf of those 6 plaintiffs. So those 6 plaintiffs can now get a passport that accurately reflects who they are, but that leaves out all the people impacted. So we asked the court, would they expand the injunctive relief to include all people who are impacted? So it'd be transgender people, people who identify as intersex, people who identify as gender non-binary. So we did file that motion last week, and there'll be briefing on it. So litigation, it goes slowly. There'll be briefing on it, and obviously the Trump administration is going to file their response to that. And it's our hope that we'll be able to widen this kind of relief. And one of the things we argued in the case initially was, when you grant this relief, grant it to the whole population. The judge wasn't willing to do so, absent some more specific legal arguments. So that's what we're focusing and emphasizing in our legal brief to the court.
Gender individuals wait
Yes.
then before applying?
Yep, don't apply to get a corrected passport. I mean, if your passport's expiring and you're planning on traveling, you do need to apply. You're not going to get a passport that's going to reflect who you are. The State Department said that in terms of transgender people who, let's say you have a current passport that reflects your gender identity, that you're not going to have any problems or harassment when you return to the United States. But once again, as we mentioned earlier tonight, it's going to be a problem for people whose passport doesn't reflect who they are, and in other countries while they're traveling.
Rubio is actually working on this whole passport thing personally.
So what should have happened was there should have been proposed administrative procedures, but they went right ahead. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah. Senator Rubio, who is in my opinion, has drunk the Kool-Aid and decided he's all in. What does he have, 4 jobs now or something like that? He's a National Archivist. He's head of the National Security Council, right? He's Secretary of State, and he's got his hands all over people's passports. Yeah. Anything else? I want to thank you. I'm so glad that I was able. I'm so happy to be able to do this in person, but also just to have the conversation with all of you. And thank you for your great questions. And I really, I am, despite all the stuff I said to you, I really am a half glass full kind of guy. I know we are going to get through this. It's just, it's a challenging time right now, but I always feel so much better when I see all of you, and I know that it's not just my fight, it's not a couple people's fight, it's all of our fight, and we're in this together. So thank you so much.